I'm back at our snippet edit page. So we're going to start working on this thing. And I can tell you right away, this is probably going to end up being the busiest file inside of our entire project. The reason for this is very simple. There's just a lot of things we need to do inside this file. First, we need to do some data fetching. We need to go and find the appropriate ID because we need to show some kind of starting information about the snippet the user is actually trying to edit. Secondly, we need to show a code editor on the screen, and we're going to show an actual real code editor here, not just a text area. And then finally, after a user changes this code in some way and they click that save button, we also need to update some data. So there's a couple of different topics we're going to touch on here. First, we need to fetch data, which we've done a little bit. We need to update some data, which means we need a server action. And then we also need to show this code editor thing, which is going to be its own challenge. Let's get started with the easy part first, just fetching our data. We're going to fetch the current snippet. We've already done this already inside the show page. Let's just go ahead and do it again. To fetch the snippet so we can actually edit it, at the very top of the file, I will import our Prisma client from @/db. Now we are doing some data fetching inside this component, which means it needs to be an async server component. Let's make sure we mark it as async. Then right after ID right here, I'll get my snippet with an await db snippet find first where ID is ID. And we can condense that down to just be ID like so. Then we need to once again handle the case in which we are not able to find the snippet the user is looking for. We can once again make use of that not found function that we took a look at earlier. So at the very top of the file, let's import not found from next navigation. Then down here, if we are not able to find a snippet, we'll return early with a call to not found. As a little test, just to make sure this is going down the right path, let's change the div down here to editing snippet with title, and then put in snippet.title. Quick save, quick test, and yeah, definitely looks like it's working correctly. And if I try to go and edit a snippet that doesn't exist by changing the URL, I'll see that same, sorry, but we couldn't find that particular snippet. Okay, so I think we're off to a good start here. Next up, let's work on showing an actual code editor to the user that has the code out of the snippet that we just fetched. To do so, we're going to use a third-party package called the React Monaco Editor. This is a React component that we can import and use inside of our project very easily. Whenever we use it, it's going to show a fully featured code editor, complete with syntax highlighting and type inference and autocomplete, all that kind of good stuff. The only issue here is that the React Monaco editor is a React component, and it absolutely positively requires hooks and event handlers to work correctly. So we need to make a component that's going to make use of hooks and event handlers. And that's assigned to us that, well, we're probably going to need to make a client component. Remember, as much as possible, we try to make server components, but if we have to use hooks or event handlers, we need a client component. Now you might think, or I should say at least one option would be to take the component we're already working on right here and turn it into a client component. But that's not going to work because we are already doing some data fetching inside of here. And remember, a client component is usually not going to be doing data fetching, and it certainly cannot be doing any data fetching by using await async syntax directly in the body of the component. So here's what we're going to do instead. Right now, we've got our snippet edit page. That's the component we are working on. And it is a server component, and it has to be a server component because we're doing some data fetching inside of it. We're going to create a new component. It's going to be a client component called the snippet edit form. We're going to have it be a child of our snippet edit page. And we're going to have our page pass down the snippet that we just pulled out of our database as a prop to the snippet edit form. This client component is then going to use some state and some event handlers to set up and work with this Monaco editor. So that's the plan. Let's go ahead and give it a shot back inside of our editor. To get started, first inside of my src directory, I'm going to make a new folder called components. We are making a child component right here, and it is a child component that is a client component, usually we're going to make client components inside of this separate components directory of our project. Again, we're doing this just to keep our app directory a little bit cleaner. Inside there, I'll make a new file called snippet edit form.tsx. I'll then export default my function snippet edit form. We absolutely want this component to be a client component because it needs to use state and event handlers. So to specify that, at the very top of the file, we will add in use client. Next up, we also really expect this component to receive a prop called snippet. So I'm going to destructure that out of the props list. TypeScript wants us to apply a type to that. Let's take care of that immediately. So I'm going to make a new interface in here called snippet edit form props. And I'm going to say this thing should have a snippet. And the type for it, we're going to import out of the Prisma library. Turns out that Prisma itself already defines interfaces of all these different records that we have inside of our database. So we could redefine the snippet interface right here, or we could just make use of the one that's already defined for us by Prisma. To make use of the Prisma one, we'll do a import type snippet from at Prisma/client. And now I can use that snippet interface like so. And then finally, I can make use of the props interface right there. All right, once again, for right now, just as a little bit of testing, let's just put in a div that says client component has snippet with title, and then put in the snippet's title. Let's then make sure that our server component, in this case, remember it's called the snippet edit page, is going to show this new client component. And when it shows it, it's going to pass down that snippet as props. We will go back over to our snippet edit page. At the top, we will import our client component that we just created called snippet edit form. Then down at our return, I'm going to clear out that div and replace it with a snippet edit form. And we need to pass down the snippet that we did some data fetching for. Okay, as usual, back over to the browser, quick test, and I see client component has snippet with title, blah, blah, blah. Perfect. Okay, so this right here is a perfect example of fetching some data inside of a server component and then realizing, you know what, to work with this data meaningfully inside the browser, we really need to use state and event handlers. So we've got our server component doing the data fetching. We then take that data and pass it as a prop down into the client component. One other thing I want to remind you about really quickly, because even though right now this isn't super relevant, eventually it's going to become really important. If you open up your browser's Chrome inspector, or I should say your inspector for whatever browser you're using, you can do that by right-clicking anywhere and clicking on Inspect. Go to the Network tab. And then once here, while looking at the edit page, go ahead and refresh. And then click on Edit right there. When you click on Edit, go to Preview. So take a look at what we get in Preview. This says client component has snippet with title, function that adds numbers. And that's kind of what we expect, right? Like, yeah, it's the content we want to see on the screen. But what's much more relevant is the fact that this content right here is being produced by a client component. So that means for us to see that information right there coming back in this response that we're making, or the request that we're making off to Next.js, that means that clearly our client component is in fact being rendered on the server. 100% that's what's happening right now. We are rendering the client component on the server and then taking the resulting HTML, sending it down to the browser. And then a little bit later on, all the appropriate JavaScript from that component gets sent down to the browser as well. So again, I just want to repeat, right now, it's not super important to understand that client components are in fact rendered in the server just one single time, but later on, that's going to become something that's really important to us. All right, so we've done our data fetching. Next step is to show the code editor.